The 4 years of Robert F. Kennedy's presidency have come to an end, a presidency full of victories against the Germans and Japanese and preparations for a full-scale battle over the Japanese occupation. In domestic policy, he battled against poverty, managing to reduce it to 21% and passed the Civil Rights Act to begin to destroy segregation, though only barely. And it was this failure, together with other factors, that led to his and the NPP's electoral defeat in the 1968 presidential election. And thus, January 20th, Philip Hart, the Democrat, was inaugurated as the new president of the United States of America. He has promised to work on 4 things, not including foreign policy, and all 4 revolve around the poor state of our cities. While Kennedy did bring down poverty, crime and homelessness is still high and the economy and budget of the average town is struggling. Therefore, the 4 areas of work are improving infrastructure, mainly the interstate highways, overseeing a rebirth of American cities, put new efforts into research and science, and finally combat discrimination hidden in the blueprints of our cities. But before we can begin working on these, we must set the tone of the Hart presidency and begin the Senate negotiations to pass our first few acts. With the majority in the Senate for the RD coalition, it looks like a smooth presidency is up ahead, especially since together with the progressives in the MPP, we the Democrats also have a majority. And thus, with the inauguration over and all new ministers appointed, the first act, the Substance Abuse and Recovery Act, was presented to Congress. With support of 60 senators from all 4 groups, the act was easily passed, starting the battle for the revival of our cities with a clear victory. And thus we propose the next act, the Urban Housing Opportunity Act, which will, through an ambitious idea of affirmative action, equalize the table for minorities. Due to this being highly controversial, not even half of the Republicans supported it, but with the support from NPP progressives it passed nonetheless. And with that, the tone has been set and the commitment to the battle of our cities has been affirmed. Considering their situation isn't as critical anymore, we can focus on transportation instead, mainly on the failing state of the Federal Highway Program and its interstates. It has constant issues from budgeting to staffing. Thus, we will begin fighting the inefficiencies and increase funding for the program. This little action was enough to ensure that construction of some highways started, but at this rate it would take years, and since America is built upon these highways and the trucking industry, we must continue. And we've decided to pursue a policy of divide and conquer, where we will start by finishing the I-95 that connects the whole East Coast from north to south. As work seriously began, the Hart administration was hit with its first foreign policy challenge. Some months ago, the previous administration had successfully helped the Free French forces defeat the Cameroonian Pan-Africanists. And after this victory, the idea of returning back to France had become increasingly talked about among the exiles. Soon they had negotiated with Franco to be allowed to pass through Gibraltar, and before we knew it they had landed on the mainland and a full-blown reclamation had started. Despite Hart being far less hawkish compared to RFK, his secretary Harry Truman is there to take the role, and will immediately send as much support to the French resistance as possible. Back home, with the construction starting well, Hart had called up his protégé Ted Kennedy, who had been working on a healthcare bill that would ensure national healthcare insurance to everyone. Together with the NPP progressives and a handful of Republicans, the bill was passed to the jubilation of our population. While it went through the Senate, Hart shifted our focus from transportation to business and economy, the core part of our cities and where they are currently struggling. Our main focus will be to create a better economy for our workers, for example by ensuring our trade agreements are free and fair. We will also work to reignite domestic production and consumption. Even the army will get a slice as they greatly help our research. However, we must be careful because the budget hawks who are constantly chippering that we spend too much are not completely wrong. So we will both put forward rules and regulations to stop our cities from overspending, as well as establish benchmarks to mark our progress so that we don't spend money on the wrong things. And since poverty and homelessness both are under control, this means according to our benchmark we must focus on crime. But before we started, we received the great news that our support had reached the French, and since the Vichy army was in disarray due to a lost war against the Odenstadt Burgundy, the Free French forces were able to rapidly liberate the whole country. Not long after, as Charles de Gaulle had established the caretaker government, they officially joined the OFN together with their African allies. And this is not only a huge victory for the OFN, but a huge blow to the Germans, because we are now back on the European mainland. But back to Hart's work, it is time to combat crime and lawlessness that is plaguing our cities. Our solution is twofold: continue what the previous administrations have done by listening to every police department and address their complaints. For example, funding them so they can afford better equipment and training to fight back against the criminals. However, we will also do what no president has dared doing yet, being to restrict the enabler of violent crime, guns. This is of course a controversial topic, but we have a plan. By starting to restricting it to groups like the KKK, something no one in their right mind would be against, we make the American people get used to gun control. And with the great news of a first black Supreme Court Justice, Thurgood Marshall, being appointed with 71 votes for, the start of our work on the Arm Control and Indexing Act of 1970 wasn't reported much on by the media. Through some shenanigans, we even got support from the Republicans on the bill, so once it was announced to Congress, it wasn't even close to be shot down. And so a huge blow has been struck against crime. While we do have some other plans, with the midterms soon arriving, Hart has decided that we must focus on at least one more of the 4 commitments, since so far only 2 have been worked on. It was quickly decided that the third area would be that of science. Because the faster we reform our education system, the faster the long-term benefits will be seen. We will immediately begin constructing more schools all throughout the nation and also start reforming the school system as a whole. We made the curriculum more patriotic to ensure that our future generations see liberty and freedom with the same importance as we do. We also passed the Primary Course Meal Act to provide every child with free school lunch, which will lead to better grades. We also began combating segregation and gender discrimination in schools. Then there is of course more to come, but interesting developments in France force us to take a look there. Due to the French victory and with Bormann working to dismantle the shadow state of Burgundy, it finally collapsed into a chaotic civil war. It wasn't long before the Germans themselves joined it, and therefore our French allies invaded as well to reclaim their lands. Unfortunately, we didn't have the time to help out, but they managed it themselves, and a new border had soon been established, now with the German Reich itself. Despite the risk of skyrocketing tensions, we decided not to negotiate with the Nazis like the previous government had. Instead, Henry Kissinger, Hart's national security advisor, had taken the liberty to shift our foreign policy towards a détente with the Japanese and escalation on ruining the Germans. He has already started negotiations with the Japanese, though they have been quite fruitless for now, and created a radio station in Europe to undermine German authority. Back to our school reforms, with the construction of them already complete, we can further increase funding of our public school program and also begin building libraries instead, who serve as an important meeting place for our communities. We also began a program of after-hour study halls to allow those who need more time to learn. There was a plan to invite the Japanese to a knowledge Olympiad between our students to help Kissinger's diplomacy, but with it seemingly reaching a halt over the issue of Hawaii, we instead set up interstate competition as the next best thing. This left one final reform left, to pass the National Education Act, which easily passed, meaning our curriculum will be a lot more centralized and open to positive change. And thus, with our education reforms dealt with, we can turn elsewhere, and by looking at the average town, there is one thing that stands out: the low purchasing power of our citizens. Fortunately, somewhat of a solution can strangely be found in our transportation focus. So far, our interstate construction has gone slowly, and we've already been forced to invest more. Fortunately though, some of its fruits can already be collected. For example, after working towards connecting rural America to the highways, positive effects on the economies of small towns could be seen almost instantly. However, when talking about transportation and purchasing power, the cost of a car is something that always comes up. and recent years it has gone up by a lot. Fortunately, we've recognized this problem, but to find a solution we need to hold a survey of the American people so we know what we should do. While we waited for it to finish, Hart put the Clean New Deal Act to a vote, which once passed significantly raised our pollution regulations. At the same time, the midterm elections were held, where the people overwhelmingly voted in support for our administration. Alone, us Democrats have 43 seats, and maybe even better news is that the segregationist MPP nationalists only have 3 seats left. Which means we can soon begin with the 4th objective of Hart's presidency, that of true desegregation. But before that could begin, a destabilizing Middle East forced us to do completely different things. It had started with rebellions in Yemen, but it soon spread to Oman, Egypt and Iraq. This caused the Italian oil company ENI to be disrupted, leading to huge price fluctuation in the value of oil, which soon led to a full-blown oil crisis, causing damage to economies everywhere in the world. Fortunately, with our government's investments into alternative energy sources, the worst effects have been mitigated. However, it still hits us hard. Of course, with all these civil wars in the Middle East, we have intervened, and American troops are already on their way to Sudan and Oman, with significant support heading towards the small Iraqi Republic. Our first troops arrived to Oman, where we immediately staged offensives against the Japanese-supported Imamate. A battle against 2 German volunteers also occurred, where we won, which allowed us to outflank the Japanese and destroy the Imamate. At the same time, our volunteers to Sudan had arrived, and just in the right moment to protect Khartoum from falling to German forces. After successfully defending the city, we launched our own offensive, which captured the city of Dongola and split the German-supported faction in 2. While we began moving south towards their capital, we returned to Oman, where our forces, together with the Italian, who support the same side as we do, fully wiped out the German volunteers and what little resistance was left in the country. Leaving Sudan for our generals to deal with, we returned back home to deal with the economic crisis. While as said we have been protected from its worst effects, the higher oil prices have hit one of our projects especially hard, that of the use and construction of our interstates. Because to save oil we had to lower speed limits, hurting our progress. Fortunately, we have discovered an alternative to our interstates, railroads. After its golden days during the era of westwards expansion, it has fallen headlong into decline. But this ends here because we will begin a public rail initiative, Amtrak. The plan isn't to construct new railways, instead we will purchase decommissioned rail and repair and modernize it. We quickly decided that despite the cost, we would electrify every important railroad. While waiting for it to finish, we started more minor and local rail installations in our cities as well. Soon enough, the idea of a Japanese-inspired high-speed rail was raised, and it quickly gained support in our administration. So soon, the US DOT Modernization Act was presented to Congress to allow for the creation of this. Surprisingly, it passed with everyone except 2 supporting it, which means all we have to do now is to wait for everything to be put in place, and then we can begin reaping the benefits. During these rapid rail investments and reforms, the survey about our cars had arrived, and the solution it found was subsidies. We will simply pump a lot of resources into our car industry to help both the manufacturers and the consumers. So despite the budget hawks bickering about our spending, we increased our subsidies by a lot. But they didn't come for free for the manufacturers, because we also introduced several new regulations to make the produced cars safer. In addition, we also cooperated with them to make their cars more fuel efficient. And finally, back to supporting the consumer, we did our best to reduce gas prices, mostly by subsidizing new trade deals. During all these efforts to heal ourselves from the oil crisis, the chaos in the Middle East had spread. The conflict in Sudan is still dragging on, but victory is close. Then, unfortunately, we failed in Iraq, where the Japanese-supported faction won. However, we have a greater opportunity to redeem ourselves, because after the Shah of Iran was assassinated, the revolutionary Iranian Liberation Front was established, where everyone from Islamists to Bolsheviks united against the monarchy. With the Germans having a lot of influence in the monarchy, we would of course send support to their opposition, and more precisely the liberal part of the revolt. Because if liberalism win, Iran would probably join the OFN, making them an incredibly important ally in the middle of Germany and Japan. We will send 3 volunteer divisions together with aircrafts to support them from the air. Congress also passed the Iranian aid bill, sending money, advisors and CIA operatives to the country. While waiting for our soldiers to arrive and planning for swift warfare, the last battles were fought in Sudan and a victory for democracy was soon declared, which not only gives us a bigger economic sphere but also allows us to focus all our efforts on Iran, where the time for battle has arrived. After the quick destruction of the monarchy, the united front against it would soon collapse, which started the more difficult part of the war. Victory, our gamble of swift warfare has paid off, and just like we hoped, the OFN has now reached the Middle East. But the war still took some time which Hart used back home to pass the last few planned reforms of our transportation sector. Because with fuel and car costs starting to return to normal, we can continue improving our highway program. Funding thus increased significantly once again, and we continued the work of connecting our urban areas as well as providing rural America with more roads. Finally, with construction going well, we decided to begin more construction of several new interstates through the passing of the Highway Expansion Act. And with that, our transportation reforms are finished, especially as the railway modernizations are also done, with its effects being seen from everywhere throughout our nation. This, together with governmental stability, has turned around our nation from the despair it experienced after John F. Kennedy's death back to the malaise. And if Hart continues his work, a ray of hope in this dark world would soon rise. To achieve this though, we would have to begin working on destroying the segregation baked into our society, but with presidential elections only 1 year away, it would be best to save this for our second term. So instead we will continue working on fighting crime and the economy, which we did about 2 years ago. But before we could begin, Henry Kissinger, you might remember him from his attempt to negotiate with the Japanese, had returned with plans to embargo Germany and attempt to fully isolate it from the outside world, to let it rot from the inside. Of course, the embargo plan passed the Senate, with them even allowing the CIA to conduct missions in the Reich. We would, for example, gather support among their people and banks for the opposition. But the process of dismantling the Reich is a slow one, and we will now return home to start finishing our anti-crime reforms. We continued establishing law and order, and we also started working with mayors to establish gun-free zones near schools, libraries and other young people-dense areas. Then, while working together with Senator Birch Bayh, we also discovered the true magnitude of the drug trade in our country, which due to its size will be impossible to destroy right now. But as our last anti-crime law, we will make sure to try our absolute best to put a dent in its operations. You might remember how we set up benchmarks a while back. Well, now we have succeeded with our objective to lower crime, and we will instead put our new objective to fully relaunch the economy after the oil crisis. And we will do this by raising domestic production and consumption. Together with the unions, we discussed how to raise production, and by expanding our commitment to rural America, we will begin raising our agricultural output. But to increase the consumption of American goods, who are often more expensive, will be far harder. We will therefore start an initiative called Buy America, which in the short term will anger the public and lower their spending power, but by slowly persuading them, we will achieve our goals. We did this by opening the checkbook of the state to subsidize spending on American goods, which quickly neglected the negatives in the beginning and allowed us to surpass the previous consumer spending power, even catapulted over it. And with the passing of the Cooperative Act, we also ensured that these improvements would stay. And that was the last major law passed for these 4 years of presidency, because election season had now picked up significantly and we will now simply work on some minor issues while preparing for our victory in the election and the coming focus on segregation destruction. These minor issues were, for example, that of our veterans, whom we supported through the Forever GI Bill, and we also further increased our commitment of rural America, mostly by huge investments with the eventual goal to combat rural flight. However, before we could finish, we were reached with devastating news. President Hart has been diagnosed with melanoma, the most dangerous type of skin cancer, and after further tests, his doctors concluded that the cancer had spread further than just his skin, meaning that Hart is going to die. All good things must come to an end, but it is not quite time yet. Hart will begin working to ensure that the administration will continue the work, even if he's gone, and he's already started preparing for his resignation. This will of course take way time from implementing his reforms, but we will still at least be able to start his anti-segregation reforms, especially since we have won the election, which turned out much like the 1968 election, only Maine voting differently. So the reforms to destroy the hidden discrimination could start. We began by breaking up the so-called redlining and even found a way to get in some good old transportation reforms while we were now working with city maps. But with the preparations for his resignation, these reforms took longer than usual to implement. We were still able to pass substantial reforms through Congress, however, mainly the Municipality Housing Act. We would also already see the improvements of our American cities as more and more people reach the American dream. However, with Hart's cancer seemingly getting worse, his reforms stopped and we would simply focus on preparing for his resignation. And soon it arrived. As he announced it to the public, a wave of sadness spread throughout the country, and Hart would receive plenty of letters from everyone telling him how he had reignited their hope in the US of A. Soon the vice president was inaugurated, and while his administration was chaotic the first 2 to 3 months, Morrison had soon reorganized the administration to continue Hart's work. A work that will have a lasting legacy on our nation, as it has fully reformed our cities, from urban hellscapes to as close as paradise as could be. Hart will also be remembered as the president which administered our country in a time where democracy around the world started to bloom and the Nazis wither away. Because the CIA's work has done wonders. They are still stuck in their oil crisis and Bormann's leadership is approaching winter as Herbst has already kicked in. One could say that the ray of hope that we've been looking for has finally arrived. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this second and last part of the USA in TNO, and I'll see you in the next video.